John Keller always thought of himself as a logical man, a man of reason. But that night, as the storm raged outside, he could feel something shift in the air, something unnatural. He had moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town only a week ago. It had been a steal, an inheritance from an uncle he'd never met. The house was large, isolated, and full of creaking floorboards and peeling wallpaper. At first, it seemed like the perfect place to escape the chaos of the city, to rebuild his life. Yet, there was something about the house that gave him chills, a subtle presence in the corners of his vision that made the hairs on his neck stand up. It was a Thursday evening, and the wind howled through the cracks in the windows. John had been unpacking boxes all day, moving his things into the house with the monotonous rhythm of a man trying to ignore his growing unease. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional thud of the old wood settling and the distant rumble of thunder. But now, as the rain picked up, John felt a strange compulsion to go downstairs. The hallway was long, stretching out in front of him like a dark tunnel, lit only by the flickering light of a single overhead bulb. He descended the stairs carefully, the sound of his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silence. At the bottom of the stairs, a large wooden door stood at the end of the hallway, his uncle's study. The door was old, and the brass handle gleamed in the dim light, as if it had been polished recently. John had never been inside. He had heard stories, whispers, about his uncle's study. The housekeeper, an elderly woman named Mrs. Fowler, had warned him to stay away from it, but she had only spoken of it in hushed tones, as if the very mention of the room could summon something. "Better not," she had said, eyes wide. "Best leave that room alone, Mr. Keller. Trust me, there's a reason your uncle kept it locked up." But John was too curious. He wasn't one to believe in superstitions or ghosts. He was a man who believed in answers, and he wanted to know what was behind that door, what his uncle had left for him. The door creaked as John turned the handle. Inside, the study was as he expected. Dusty bookshelves lined the walls, with piles of old papers scattered across the desk. A large, ornate chair sat behind it, facing the wall. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. He walked deeper into the room, his eyes scanning the shelves. Some of the books were strange. Old, tattered, leather-bound volumes that looked as though they belonged to another time. A few were marked with symbols he didn't recognize, but what caught his attention was a small, intricately carved box on the desk. It was covered in dust, but something about it drew him in. John reached out and touched the box. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, he felt a jolt of cold run through his body. He jerked his hand back, his heart racing. There was a sudden thud from behind him, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door closing. He spun around, but there was no one there. The room was still, silent. But then, the air grew heavier. His breath became labored, and the temperature dropped, causing his breath to fog in front of him. John turned back to the box, his pulse quickening. Something was wrong. His eyes flicked to the desk again, and for a split second, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A faint figure standing behind the chair. The figure was shrouded in shadow, but John could make out a twisted face, its eyes dark and hollow. A chill ran down his spine, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the desk. He had to get out. As he rushed to the door, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Soft, deliberate steps. They grew louder, closer, and then, just as his hand reached for the door handle, the figure appeared in the doorway. Its face, pale and gaunt, was twisted into a grotesque smile. Its eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a wave of nausea through him. "John," the figure whispered, its voice rasping, "you should have listened." John's heart hammered in his chest. He turned the handle with all his strength and flung himself into the hallway, slamming the door behind him. He didn't stop running until he reached the front door of the house, but as he tried to open it, he found it locked. The storm outside had intensified, and the wind howled as if it were mocking him. His hands shook as he fumbled with the lock, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Finally, The door creaked open. But when John stepped outside, he wasn't met with the familiar sight of the overgrown garden. Instead, there was nothing, just a void, stretching endlessly before him. The house, the street, everything was gone. He turned back, frantic. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. His heart stopped for a moment. The house was no longer there. In its place stood the shadowy figure, standing in the doorway. And as it spoke again, its voice filled with malice, John realized with a sinking heart that the house was never meant for him to leave. "You're mine now," it whispered, "and you will never escape." John screamed. The last thing he saw before the darkness overtook him was the faint outline of the old Victorian house, standing alone in the middle of an endless void.